So I'm a marine biogeochemist. I study the ocean and how phytoplankton grow and affect the carbon cycle. And I'm particularly interested in how climate change is going to affect phytoplankton populations in the future. So we're going to be talking today about some of the ways that the ocean might change in the future in response to global change. But before we do that, Toshi wanted me to give some background on kind of UCI and some of our legacy in terms of studying climate change. So Eric and I are both in the Department of Earth System Science. What makes this unique, it was the first department to be formed to actually study changes to the Earth that occur on human timescales. And we're interested in looking at not only the ocean, not only the ice sheet, not only the land, but how those systems are coupled together. So we try to take a very holistic approach to things. We also have a really long legacy at UCI of innovative and pioneering scientists. On the left, we have Norman Rostoker, who was really instrumental in advancing plasma physics. And you're going to hear from Michael Binbauer later today about some of the legacy of his work. And then on the right, you have Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina, who received Nobel Prizes for their discovery of CFCs and the effect that that has on the ozone. And so the reason that I like to tell this story is because they published their paper in 1974 on the chemistry of CFCs, showing that they could destroy ozone. And it wasn't until 1987 that the Montreal Protocol was actually ratified by 197 member states. So it's an example of a very successful environmental movement. It's one of the first real strong environmental success stories. However, it did take a considerable amount of time, almost 15 years elapsed between the time that they discovered these effects of these chemicals and then the world actually caught up and started phasing them out. So sometimes environmental progress takes a lot of time. And I'd like you to keep that in mind as I go through the talk. So in the lobby of Kroll Hall, which is home to our department here at UCI, we have this beautiful, huge image on the wall, and it's of the Earth, the beautiful blue marble that we've all seen a million times. And a lot of Earth scientists think about the Earth this way because after all, we live on land and we think about the continents. But what people sometimes don't realize is that half of the Earth is actually the Pacific Ocean. 70% of Earth's surface is water. So when we think about climate change, production of carbon, production of pollutants, the ocean is actually a very large reservoir for the Earth to experience and respond to those global changes. You're probably all familiar with the Keeling curve. It's been measured at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the late 50s. And you can see seasonal patterns every year. There's an increase and a decrease, and that's just due to summertime, wintertime dynamics in the boreal forests. But over time, we see this dramatic increase in carbon dioxide concentration. If we look into the ice cores and actually measure the CO2 in the ancient past, I'm showing this graph, it's from NASA, goes back 400,000 years. We can actually take the record back probably about twice as long as that if we want to. But what it's showing you is the cycle that some of you have already discussed in your prior talks today, that in the ancient past, we never really went above 300 ppm. Our current level is much higher than that. And that's disturbing because all of our models suggest that if we don't do anything to change our carbon production, then by the year 2100, we could have a dramatically higher amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the reason that's alarming is that also from the ice cores, using isotopic labels, we can tell what the temperature was in the past. And there's a remarkable correlation between CO2 and temperature. So we know that if we continue to add CO2 to the atmosphere, we can anticipate extreme climate warming. So how does that affect the ocean? What's going to happen? So we have increased air temperatures over the ocean. And sea surface temperatures as well. And these are important for weather patterns, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Biologically, we're going to start seeing tree lines shift up to higher altitudes and north as they try to stay within their appropriate climate regimes. We're seeing earlier springs, and we're also seeing animals move. And the reason that this matters biologically is because if the seasonality changes, sometimes species that depend on each other get out of sync, and then they can't survive as well. So this is one of the reasons why we're expecting mass extinctions to occur due to climate change. We also know that the glaciers are retreating, snow covers decreasing, ice sheets and sea ice, they're all on decline because of the warming. And at the same time, we have sea level rising and increases in humidity, which can also affect weather patterns. Here in Orange County and in Southern California, we're already seeing some of the effects of this. In terms of flooding, a lot of our properties are built right directly on the coast. We have some islands and some bays where the water is literally right on people's doorsteps. Some modeling work done by a colleague of mine in the engineering department suggests that by 2050, big parts of Southern California will be flooded and inundated with water. And in fact, some of the more affluent areas are already building larger seawalls, increasing the height of their seawalls in order to prevent the storm surge from affecting their property. But perhaps more seriously, we have the effects of sea level rise on populations in the South Pacific. So this is a photograph of the island of Tuvalu, which has a maximum elevation of 5 meters. Most of it is at sea level. So with the sea level rise that Eric was talking about earlier, you can imagine that this entire nation is going to be underwater. So that means an entire nation of people are now refugees. They have to find another place to live. So it's a really big existential problem that some of us who are not so affected by the sea level rise might not appreciate, but it's an important one to keep in mind. So one of the analogies that I like to share with my students, and I think you might enjoy it too, is something that Steve Snyder, who's a scientist at Stanford when I was in graduate school, and he always described climate change as it's like the weather on steroids. So climate is like over long periods of time. The weather is like what happens day to day. And so when people say, okay, there's this huge storm happening, is that because of climate change? And so he would use this analogy. So in America, a lot of people play baseball. It's like one of our favorite sports. And there was this guy, Barry Bonds, and he was found to be using steroids. And so what Steve would say is, well, if you watch Barry Bonds hit a home run, is it because he took steroids? You don't know, because he could hit home runs before he took steroids and he could hit home runs after he took steroids. But what you do know is that the frequency and the intensity of the home runs that he hit when he was on steroids is much higher than when he's not. And that's the analogy with weather. So we can't attribute a storm to climate change, but we can say that we're going to have more frequent and more intense storms. In terms of how it affects weather, the ocean plays a really large role in affecting weather and humidity patterns because of evaporation from the ocean goes into the atmosphere, and this is what drives storms. So we know that we're going to start seeing higher storm surge, like this photograph right here. If we have higher sea level rise and then we have bigger storms that are more intense on top of it, we can expect the ocean to surge onto properties. We can expect more flooding. This is a photograph from Hurricane Katrina. At the same time, while some regions are going to get more rain, some are going to get less rain. We're going to start seeing more drought. And of course, a big one here in California, because of our drought problem, is we have a lot of wildfires, which causes a lot of property damage, but also it affects the ecosystem because then we get mudslides when the rains finally come. Okay, so back to the ocean. So the other problem with climate change is not just the warming of the water itself, but the CO2 actually dissolving into the ocean and causing acidification to happen. So the way that this works is we generate all of our CO2 and it goes into the atmosphere and it has to go somewhere. So it turns out that about half of it stays in the atmosphere, and that's the stuff that's contributing to the heat trapping capacity of the CO2 and the global warming. The other half, about half of that goes into the ocean and half of it goes into terrestrial sinks. In the ocean, it actually changes the chemistry of the water and causes it to become more acidic. So this is a graph that demonstrates what I'm talking about here. So the solid line on the top being the pH of the ocean, which is naturally around 8.2. And here we are kind of around present day. It should be a little over. We see the pH has already started to decline significantly. It's already declined over 30%. So that's a lot more acidic, especially if you're an organism that has needs to be in homeostasis. And that's being driven largely by this increase in CO2 that we see. So we know that the CO2 is going to keep increasing, and we can project that the pH is going to continue to go down. Now, this plot was actually generated in a paper when I was in graduate school. I think it was around 2005. And the reason that I like to still show it is because it's now in error. It has an error in it. And I wonder if you can spot it. I'll show you. It's here. When I was in graduate school, and that was, well, I'm not going to say how many years ago that was, but it was a few years ago. And it was at 380 was the level of the CO2. And now today, I just checked, yesterday's measurement was 415. So in that short period of time, we've already increased our CO2 measurably. So this is a real problem, and it is directly measurable. Ocean acidification, I could give multiple hours of lectures on this. I'm just going to show you a little bit about it. It's important because organisms that calcify or make their shells out of calcium carbonate can sometimes have a hard time surviving when it's under more acidic conditions. So this organism I'm showing you is called a pteropod, and it's like a little sea snail. They swim around and they kind of float around in the surface ocean. And they're very reliant on calcium carbonate to protect them because it's a soft-bodied organism. And so this team did an experiment where they exposed these organisms for 45 days at the projected CO2 levels for the year 2100. And you can see the effect that it has on the shell. So over time, by the 45th day, the shell is basically dissolved. And the reason that this matters is because if the organism has to spend extra energy making new shell all the time, that's energy that it doesn't have to forage for food or escape a predator or mate. So it really is a bad sign for the species if they have to expend extra energy. It makes them less ecologically fit. And this is one of the reasons that people are concerned about ocean acidification. It's not just pteropods, there's also phytoplankton species that make calcareous shells that are being affected, as well as corals, coral reefs, which get the double whammy of having the ocean acidification on top of the warming, which causes coral bleaching to occur. So that's why that's a problem. Let me just check the time. Okay, cool. So I wanted to leave a lot of time for discussion about geoengineering, and I'm glad to see that people have already started talking about it in the chat. So a couple of years ago, I was at a climate symposium with an interdisciplinary group of people. And so we were talking about all of these different ways to mitigate climate change. And among them, we have carbon abatement, which is just, being more efficient with your use of energy, switching fuel types, conservation, riding a bicycle instead of driving a car, things like that, simple things that people can do. So we wanted to compare all of these other climate engineering and geoengineering techniques in an interdisciplinary way. So we were looking at things like forest management, which could be reforestation. That's when you plant trees where you've destroyed a forest. It can be afforestation, which is planting trees in areas that were not previously forests, but you're trapping carbon in that biomass. Soil management, which involves carbon storage in the soil via different farming techniques or the use of biochar, making the soil more stable so that it doesn't release that carbon back out to the atmosphere. Then we have geological burial of liquid CO2. And this is where you sequester the carbon at a point source like a factory and concentrate it down into a liquid, and then you can inject it either into the land or into the deep sea. And then we have solar radiation management, which is the idea is to reflect sunlight back into out of our atmosphere before it can have a chance to warm. And there's different ways that this can be done. You can have a marine cloud brightening by putting ions into the atmosphere. People have discussed putting large space mirrors out in space to reflect the sun. There's a number of ways that this can be done, and it's fairly controversial. And then finally, the one that I like to talk about the most because I'm an oceanographer is ocean iron fertilization. This idea rests on the fact that about 40% of the ocean has phytoplankton that their growth is limited by the nutrient iron. So they need iron as a cofactor for a lot of their enzymes and their photosynthetic electron transport chain. And so for that reason, if they don't have enough iron, then they can't grow as fast. And so oceanographers have been studying for a long time, you know, what is the cycling of this iron? And people thought, well, what if we just add shiploads of iron to the ocean? We could induce phytoplankton blooms. And as they bloom, just like land plants do photosynthesis and they take carbon out of the atmosphere and use it to make their leaves, phytoplankton do the same thing. They're taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere, out of the water, and they're making new cells. So now the carbon is stuck in that biomass. And so the idea in ocean iron fertilization is that once these blooms form, and the cells run out of iron again and they die, then they would sink to the deep ocean. And once those cells sink to the deep ocean, they're sequestered there for hundreds to thousands of years, meaning that that carbon is no longer in the atmosphere, it's now trapped in the deep ocean. So this would be kind of a quick fix sort of thing that you could just take a tanker out there and dump a lot of iron sulfate into the ocean, get a bloom, and have you know, a lot of carbon taken out of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, we've had about 15 very large-scale experiments that were international efforts in various parts of the world's oceans where this has actually been tried. And what they find is that, yes, you can induce a bloom, but what ends up happening is that instead of sinking, most of that cellular material gets respired by microbes in the surface ocean, and then it just outgasses right back to the atmosphere. So there's really no net sequestration of carbon. The only successful one where they saw, I think, 30% or so sequestration, they did it in an eddy, which is a swirling body of water, which is basically like it contains that water. So it doesn't let the algae disperse. It keeps it all in one area so that when they die, they actually do sink. But it would be very, very difficult to do this on a large scale. So these are the different types of things that we considered in the paper. And these are the perspectives that we took in looking at it. And one of the things that made this paper so interesting and unique was that prior to this study that we did, each individual discipline was evaluating the different geoengineering strategies independently. So the economists were talking about how much each strategy cost, and the politicians were talking about how implementable it was, and the scientists were talking about how technologically feasible it was. But nobody was considering the big picture. So our team got together and we considered these 6 different areas to evaluate each of these geoengineering strategies. So we looked at the technical potential. So how much carbon could we actually expect to sequester using each technique? The cost effectiveness, right? So how much money is it going to cost to actually implement this strategy? Ecological risk. So this is an important one too, because for example, with ocean iron fertilization, you can have unintended consequences of that action. You might select for toxic algal species that might have a bad effect on the animals that live in that area. You could cause anoxic conditions as the bloom starts to decay. And so we can't predict what those ecological consequences are necessarily going to be. For some geoengineering strategies, it's easier to tell, but for ocean iron fertilization, not really. We also considered ethical concerns. So about how is this going to affect people and non-human nature as well. Institutional capacity is the ability of a governing body to implement the given strategy. And that rests a lot on whether you're doing something locally or regionally or internationally. Because if you're doing something in international waters like ocean iron fertilization, then really it should be an effort that's agreed upon by all the nations of the world and not just one. And then finally, public acceptance is a big one. So it's not always clear what drives the acceptance of different strategies. For example, solar radiation management, which is seen by most scientists to be a terrible, terrible idea. The public is actually fascinated by it. I don't know whether it's because they think space mirrors are cool or because it just seems like it would be a rapid and cheap fix to a problem, but it's actually very problematic. So I'll show you the results of how we evaluated this stuff. So this is the paper. If you want a copy of it, I'd be happy to share it. The way that you read each of these graphs is the higher the amount of color is like the better strategy. So like here, forest management is very technically high potential, so it gets the highest mark. If it's low on the scale, like abatement is not very cost effective. So that's how you read each of these graphs. And what I want you to kind of hone in on is that the ones that you would expect to be pretty good are pretty good. The ones that are really, really bad in terms of our assessment are ocean iron fertilization and solar radiation management. Okay, and we can kind of talk about why. Some of the main reasons for ocean iron fertilization being a problem is that we don't know what unintended consequences there are. The public is very concerned about doing things to the ocean. They're very protective of the oceans. There's low public acceptance of it. In terms of institutional capacity, it's also ranked very low, precisely because of the reason that I mentioned, being that if you're going to fertilize in international waters, then it really shouldn't be the task of one government to decide when and where to do so. Technical potential is also on the low side because doing very broad scale fertilization efforts is hard to do. You would need a fleet of ships and a lot of iron in order to induce any measurable change, especially given what we know about the fact that most of the carbon is respired by microbes and goes back into the atmosphere. Moving to the stratospheric aerosols, or that solar radiation management, this also ranks very low. And interestingly, I think I took the slide out, but in the United States, our research council came up with, I think back in 2015, they came up with a series of recommendations on these geoengineering strategies, and they put it in a booklet, and they didn't include solar radiation management. They actually put solar radiation management in its own book to demonstrate how strongly against doing it the American scientists are. And yet, as I mentioned, people are generally pretty interested in it. It's not something that they necessarily understand. It doesn't actually address the carbon problem, for example. Like in the ocean, where we have ocean acidification, that's from the carbon. So if we start blocking the sunlight, that might be a quick fix in order to control the temperature, but it wouldn't actually fix the problem of ocean acidification, which is affecting the organisms dramatically. The other problem with solar radiation management is that it tends to not address internationally how it would be implemented. In other words, if you have one country putting stratospheric aerosols up, it could affect weather patterns in another country, a neighboring country. So there's a lot of problems with international collaboration and coordinating these sorts of ethics. So one of the reasons I think that there's such a problem with the public coming to terms with climate change and how we can get people to come together and align is that when you're a climate scientist and you're trying to talk science to somebody who's not a scientist, you have to keep in mind that they have different values, right? So some people value the economics, some people value, keeping the earth clean. Some people value, passing on a clean planet to future generations, not leaving them with a problem that's too big to solve. So when I speak to people about climate change and these issues, I like to always bring up the fact that there's a potential to create new jobs when we have a clean energy sector, transition to the green energy. If you care about preserving Earth and being a good steward of the Earth, we can talk about that once we eliminate these carbon problems, we're actually doing right by nature and taking care of the Earth in the way that we were supposed to. And that we
about 5 minutes for your talk part, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm almost done. And then, like I said, not leaving our children with a problem that's too big to solve. So when we point these things out to people, it's easier to bring them into alignment, and it makes accepting the climate science a little bit more palatable. So I started the talk off by introducing you to these fellows, and I wanted to end the talk by talking about them again. And just with the perspective of, the modern environmental movement saw a success story when it came to the CFCs and the hole in the ozone. The scientific evidence came out. About 15 years later, the international community came together and decided that they were going to fix the problem. Unfortunately, climate change is a little bit different than the hole in the ozone layer. The hole in the ozone layer was letting in UV light that was causing higher incidences of cancer. It took 15 years to get on board, but they finally did it. Climate change is a very different animal. It is an existential threat to the Earth and to all of humanity, and it cannot wait 15 years. It should have been taken care of 15 years ago or earlier. And so this is why it's so dramatically important that things start to happen now, and that we start to use less carbon immediately in order to avert future changes. So I'd just like to leave you with a couple of thoughts. This is from a woman named Susan Hassel, who's a climate communicator. She teaches people how to talk about climate. And she basically summed up climate change in 10 words. It's real, it's us, it's bad. Scientists agree, 97% of scientists agree that it's human caused, and there's hope. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, or we can start a discussion on geoengineering if people have comments to make.
All right, Kate, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. And then, of course, it triggers all the audience to ask questions and comments. But in this case, we have about 5 minutes to work on. So if you are storing your questions and comments for previous 4 speakers as well as Kate's talk, we will make a mixture of those questions and comments, okay? So please.
I'd like to ask Kate about this climate engineering. So thank you very much for your very interesting talk, of course. And I looked at this chart. You demonstrated what kind of solution can be used just for this engineering. But any engineering takes time, because just if we do this forest engineering for the forest, it needs some time to just to grow up. Mm-hmm. Do we really have time for this engineering, having in mind probably that we are very close to the point of non-return from the just for this development of CO2 or methane release? So actually, did you compare these characteristic time scales of all those engineering you demonstrated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the paper we did, and this is, as I was saying with solar radiation management, this is one reason why I think politicians and the public are very interested in it, despite the fact that scientists are against it, is because it could be a very rapid way to stop temperature. But the downside of that is that if something goes wrong, or if we stop doing it, we could have a very abrupt rise in temperature, because all of a sudden that shading would be gone. So that one would happen on a fast time scale, and it's really not recommended. But you're right, for forests to be regrown, that takes time. One of the things we discuss in the paper is stopping deforestation. So deforestation is actually a huge contributor to the CO2 problem, because the trees hold onto the carbon in the form of their tissue, their cells. And so when we start cutting down trees, then we're releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. So I think Eric said in the comments in the chat section, he pointed out that that they are not, the geoengineering strategies are not really scalable, and there's a lot of uncertainty, which in terms of all of the different disciplines that we use to evaluate the different techniques, none of them was really found to be a perfect solution. Probably, abatement would be the best thing that we could be doing right now, but there's a huge economic cost that goes with that. And also the public doesn't want to give up its gasoline cars and coal-fired power plants. So we're making some progress, but not enough. So really what needs to happen is that the emissions need to stop. That's the primary thing. If we're going to do other strategies in concert with that, that might be another possibility, like with carbon sequestration and burial. If that technique can be perfected enough, then that might be a possibility. But if you have even 1% leakage per year, it basically makes it not a useful strategy anymore. You also have the issue of, if earthquakes happen, then that releases a very large amount of CO2 to the surrounding area, which can suffocate any living organisms. That happens naturally in certain areas. So I think they all come with a little bit of risk, but probably carbon capture and storage has the potential of helping us if we can perfect the technique.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Any other question or question?
Yeah, I have a question. Kate, I really like your system thinking, picture thinking about geoengineering, how it affects from various aspects, ecology, economy, stakeholder, etc. I'm wondering if you've looked at it from a sort of an interference or interaction with the Earth's major system and cycles perspective. Because, how we got to the CO2 problem was because we know how to mess with the fossil fuel and stuff, create all these energies, and then we mess up the cycles. Okay? Right. So if, this also would be a really good leading to my talk later, which is sort of from that consideration, how do we figure out what the solution could be? Can you expand on that? On the system of cycles?
Yeah, so in the paper we did, I actually worked quite a bit on this part. So there were two science people. Well, I was more looking at the ocean side, and then my colleague Daniela was the terrestrial person. And we did quite a bit of work looking at how the biology and the chemistry and the physics all interact when these different approaches are applied. And that was one of the things that went into our ranking for the technical potential and also the ecological risk. So we did consider those things, and just as an example for our ocean iron fertilization, it affects the carbon cycle, it affects the iron cycle, it affects the biogeography of phytoplankton, who grows where, how fast do they grow, and of course, since they're the base of the food web, that affects the entire food web all the way up. So those are just some examples of how the Earth system would respond to something like ocean iron fertilization. A lot of these techniques have ripple effects that are not necessarily obvious when you first start thinking about it, but a more thorough investigation into them reveals that they could have lasting consequences.
Okay, Kate, thank you for your comments, and also you guys, the audience, had a very interactive attitude, and also the dignity to cherish the presence, but on the other hand, living with the time. Thank you.